The October sun beat down mercilessly on Dodger Stadium as 17-year-old David Goldstein climbed the concrete steps toward the bleacher seats, clutching a $3 ticket that represented everything he'd saved from his job at Feldman's Delicatessen. It was October 6, 1965, Game 1 of the World Series between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Minnesota Twins, and David was about to witness something that would challenge everything he'd been taught about faith, tradition, and the price of greatness. The problem wasn't just that David had spent his lunch money for the next week on a baseball ticket. The problem was that today was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and he was supposed to be in temple fasting and praying for forgiveness, not sitting in the bleachers watching Sandy Koufax, the greatest Jewish athlete of their generation, pitch on the day when observant Jews weren't supposed to work. David had grown up in Fairfax, in a family where Jewish tradition wasn't just observed but lived. His father, Saul Goldstein, had survived the Depression by working 18-hour days in a small grocery store, had lost 2 brothers in the war, and had raised his children with an understanding that being Jewish meant carrying forward traditions that had sustained their people through centuries of persecution. "Some things are bigger than baseball," Saul had said that morning when David mentioned that Koufax was scheduled to pitch Game 1. "Some things are bigger than anything except your relationship with God." But David wasn't so sure. At 17, with dreams of becoming a sports writer and a passion for baseball that bordered on religious devotion, he'd been following Sandy Koufax's career with the intensity most kids his age reserve for rock stars or movie actors. Koufax wasn't just a great pitcher. He was living proof that Jewish kids from Brooklyn could compete with anyone, could excel at the highest levels of American sports, could be heroes instead of just shopkeepers and accountants. The internal conflict had been building for weeks. David knew that Koufax himself had made headlines by refusing to pitch Game 1 of the 1965 World Series because it fell on Yom Kippur. The decision had made national news, with sports writers debating whether religious observance should take precedence over professional obligation, whether Koufax was setting a noble example or letting his team down. But then something unexpected had happened. Don Drysdale, scheduled to pitch Game 2, had volunteered to start Game 1 instead, and manager Walter Alston had announced that Koufax would pitch Game 2 on October 7th, the day after Yom Kippur ended at sundown. The announcement had created a crisis in the Goldstein household. Saul had been proud of Koufax's initial decision to observe the holiday, had used it as a teaching moment about the importance of maintaining faith even when it came at great personal cost. But when the schedule changed and Koufax was moved to Game 2, the situation became more complicated. "The holiday ends at sundown tonight," David had argued at breakfast. "If Koufax pitches tomorrow, technically he won't be violating Yom Kippur." "Technically maybe," Saul had replied. "But what about the spirit of the holiday? What about taking the day to reflect on your relationship with God instead of thinking about baseball?" David had wrestled with the question all morning during services at Temple Beth Am, sitting next to his father and trying to focus on prayers while his mind kept drifting to Dodger Stadium, where 55,000 people would be watching the Dodgers try to win their first World Series game without their ace pitcher. The decision to skip the afternoon service and go to the game had been impulsive, driven by an 17-year-old's certainty that he was witnessing history and couldn't afford to miss it. He'd slipped out of Temple during a break between services, taken the bus to Chavez Ravine, and bought a $3 bleacher seat with money he'd been saving for weeks. Now, as he found his seat in Section 53 of the left field pavilion, David felt the full weight of his decision. Around him sat the kind of diverse crowd that made Los Angeles baseball special. Mexican families from East LA, white families from the suburbs, black families from South Central, all unified in their support for a team that had only moved from Brooklyn 7 years earlier, but had already become the symbol of the city's aspirations. The bleacher seats were the cheapest in the stadium, filled with working-class fans who understood the value of $3 and the importance of being present for moments that might never come again. These weren't the corporate executives and celebrities who filled the box seats behind home plate. These were people for whom baseball represented something larger than entertainment, something approaching civic religion. "First World Series game?" asked the man sitting next to David, a guy who looked to be in his 40s with hands stained by what appeared to be automotive work. "First World Series, period," David replied. "You?" "Been coming to Dodgers games since they moved from Brooklyn. This is what we've been waiting for, a chance to prove we belong in the World Series." As they talked, David learned that the man, who introduced himself as Roberto Sanchez, was a mechanic from Boyle Heights who'd taken the afternoon off work to attend the game. Like David, Roberto had made financial sacrifices to be there, understanding that World Series tickets were expensive, but believing that some experiences justified the cost. "What do you think about Koufax not pitching today?" David asked, curious about how non-Jewish fans viewed the decision. Roberto thought about the question while watching the Dodgers take batting practice. "I respect the man for sticking to his beliefs. Takes courage to do what you think is right when the whole world is watching. But I sure hope he's ready to pitch tomorrow, because we're gonna need him." The pre-game ceremonies felt more elaborate than usual, with additional media coverage and the kind of pageantry that marked baseball's biggest stage. David found himself studying the crowd, trying to estimate how many other Jewish fans might be struggling with the same conflict he'd experienced about attending a game on Yom Kippur. The answer seemed to be quite a few. During the national anthem, David noticed several men in the crowd wearing yarmulkes, suggesting that he wasn't the only observant Jew who decided that witnessing World Series history justified bending religious rules. Don Drysdale took the mound for the Dodgers, and David felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety as the game began. This was what he'd sacrificed for, the chance to see his team compete on baseball's biggest stage, to be present for moments that would be remembered for decades. But as the first inning unfolded, it became clear that Game 1 wasn't going to be the showcase David had hoped for. The Minnesota Twins jumped on Drysdale early, scoring 2 runs in the first inning and 3 more in the second. By the third inning, the Dodgers trailed 6-0, and the crowd that had been electric with anticipation was growing restless with disappointment. "This is what happens when your best pitcher doesn't start," Roberto muttered, as the Twins added another run in the fourth inning. David found himself thinking about his father's words that morning, about the idea that some things were bigger than baseball. Was Sewell right? Should David have stayed in Temple, focusing on spiritual reflection instead of watching his team get embarrassed on national television? The Dodgers rallied slightly in the later innings, scoring 2 runs to make the final score 8-2. But the damage was done. Game 1 had been a disaster, and now everything depended on Sandy Koufax's performance in Game 2. As David walked down from the bleachers after the game, he felt a mixture of disappointment about the loss and anxiety about facing his father. He'd skipped religious services to watch his team lose badly, had chosen baseball over faith, and had nothing to show for it except the knowledge that the Dodgers were now behind in the World Series. The bus ride home to Fairfax gave him time to think about what he would say to Sewell, how he would explain his decision to prioritize a baseball game over Yom Kippur observance. But as the bus wound through the streets of Los Angeles, David found himself thinking less about the game he'd just watched and more about the game that was coming tomorrow. Sandy Koufax would be pitching Game 2. The greatest Jewish athlete of their generation would be taking the mound for the most important game of his life, carrying not just the hopes of Dodgers fans, but the expectations of an entire community that saw him as proof that Jewish Americans could excel at the highest levels of competition. When David arrived home, he found his father waiting in the living room, reading the evening paper with the kind of deliberate calm that suggested disappointment but not anger. "How was the game?" Saul asked without looking up from his newspaper. "We lost," David replied honestly, 8-2. "And how was your soul?" David thought about the question. How do you explain to your father that witnessing your team lose badly had somehow felt less important than the knowledge that you'd been present for history, that you'd chosen to be there when your community's greatest athlete faced his biggest test? "I think," David said carefully, "that watching Sandy Koufax pitch tomorrow might be more important than anything I could have accomplished in Temple today." Saul finally looked up from his newspaper, studying his son's face with the expression of a man trying to understand a decision that challenged everything he'd taught about priorities and values. "You think baseball is more important than God?" "I think," David replied, "that sometimes God reveals himself through the actions of extraordinary people, and I think Sandy Koufax might be one of those people." Saul was quiet for a long moment, considering his son's words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Then you better make sure you're there tomorrow," he said, "because if you're right about Koufax being extraordinary, you don't want to miss it." The next morning, David Goldstein woke up to newspaper headlines that confirmed his worst fears about the previous day's decision. "Dodgers crushed in Game 1, read the Los Angeles Times sports section. "Twins dominate without Koufax," proclaimed the Herald-Examiner. Every analysis seemed to reach the same conclusion. The Dodgers' decision to start Don Drysdale instead of Sandy Koufax had cost them dearly, and now they faced the prospect of falling behind 2-0 in the World Series. But buried in the sports coverage was a story that made David's heart race with anticipation. Sandy Koufax would indeed be pitching Game 2, and according to several reports, he'd spent the previous day fasting and praying in observance of Yom Kippur. The greatest pitcher in baseball had chosen faith over professional obligation, and now he would take the mound carrying not just the hopes of his team, but the weight of proving that his decision had been justified. At breakfast, Saul Goldstein read the newspaper coverage with the careful attention of someone trying to understand the intersection of sports and spirituality. He'd been supportive of David's decision to attend Game 2, but the morning light had brought questions about whether encouraging his son to skip another day of school for a baseball game set the right priorities. "You sure about this?" Saul asked, looking up from an article about Koufax's Yom Kippur observance. "Missing school 2 days in a row for baseball?" "Pop, this isn't just baseball," David replied, using the same arguments he'd been rehearsing since the previous evening. "This is Sandy Koufax, the greatest Jewish athlete of our generation, pitching the most important game of his career after choosing to observe Yom Kippur instead of starting Game 1. If we don't support him now, when do we?" Saul studied his son's face and saw something that reminded him of his own youth, when choices between tradition and opportunity had seemed impossibly important. David wasn't just asking permission to attend a baseball game. He was asking for validation of a decision to prioritize community pride over conventional expectations. "Your mother's not happy about you missing more school," Saul said finally. But I understand why this matters to you. Koufax made a choice that took courage, and now he has to prove it was the right choice. Maybe witnessing that is more important than sitting in algebra class." David felt a surge of gratitude toward his father, understanding that Saul's approval represented more than just permission to attend a baseball game. It was recognition that some moments transcended normal categories, that watching a Jewish athlete prove himself on the biggest stage in American sports carried cultural significance that justified personal sacrifice. The bus ride to Dodger Stadium felt different from the previous day. Where Game 1 had been characterized by excited anticipation, the mood heading into Game 2 carried undertones of desperation and anxiety. Dodgers fans understood that falling behind 2-0 in the World Series would make their championship hopes extremely difficult, and everything depended on Sandy Koufax performing at his best after a day of fasting and religious observance. David had managed to buy another $3 bleacher ticket, this time using money his father had quietly slipped him that morning. The gesture had meant more than Sewell probably realized. It was acknowledgement that this game represented something larger than entertainment, something that justified financial sacrifice and scheduled disruption. Section 53 was packed again, but the energy was different from Game 1. The crowd that gathered was more intense, more focused, carrying the weight of understanding that they might be witnessing either a historic comeback or a crushing disappointment. These fans had invested emotionally and financially in being present for what everyone sensed would be a defining moment. Roberto Sanchez was back in his seat from the previous day, wearing the same Dodgers cap, but carrying himself with the nervous energy of someone who understood how much was at stake. "You came back," he said to David as they settled in for the pre-game warm-ups. "Had to," David replied. "Couldn't miss Koufax after what happened yesterday. Think he's ready? I mean, spending yesterday fasting and praying instead of preparing for the biggest game of his life." David had been wondering the same thing. Would Koufax be physically weakened by a day of fasting? Would his rhythm be disrupted by missing his normal pre-game preparation routine? Or would his spiritual preparation somehow enhance his focus and determination? "I think," David said, watching Koufax warm up in the bullpen, "that if anyone can pitch great after observing Yom Kippur, it's Sandy Koufax." As game time approached, David noticed something remarkable happening in the stands around him. Throughout the bleacher sections, he could see small clusters of obviously Jewish fans, men wearing yarmulkes, families speaking Yiddish, groups that had clearly made the same decision he had about being present for this moment. The presence of so many Jewish fans created an atmosphere unlike anything David had experienced at a baseball game. This wasn't just about the Dodgers versus the Twins. This was about community pride, about proving that Jewish Americans could excel at the highest levels of competition, about validating Koufax's decision to prioritize faith over professional obligation. "Look around," David said to Roberto, gesturing toward the crowd. "You see all the Jewish families here today?" Roberto followed his gaze and nodded. They came to see their guy prove himself. We all did. The pre-game ceremonies seemed to take forever, with additional media attention focused on Koufax's story and the unusual circumstances surrounding his Game 2 start. When the Dodgers took the field and Koufax walked to the mound, the crowd's response was thunderous. Not just appreciation for a great pitcher, but recognition of someone who had chosen principle over convenience and now had to prove that choice hadn't compromised his effectiveness. David studied Koufax's demeanor as he completed his warm-up pitches. The left-hander looked calm, focused, showing no signs of the physical weakness that might have resulted from a day of fasting. If anything, he appeared more determined than usual, carrying himself with the authority of someone who understood the significance of the moment. "He looks ready," Roberto observed. "He looks perfect," David replied. The first inning unfolded with the kind of precision that had made Koufax legendary. His fastball was explosive, his curveball was devastating, and the Minnesota Twins hitters looked completely overmatched. 3 batters came to the plate, and 3 batters returned to the dugout, having barely made contact with Koufax's pitches. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. These fans understood they were watching something special, not just great pitching, but vindication of a decision that had been questioned by sports writers and fans across the country. "Look at that fastball," Roberto said as Koufax struck out the side in the first inning. Guys throwing harder than he did all season. David found himself thinking about the paradox of what they were witnessing. Koufax had spent the previous day fasting and praying instead of preparing physically for the game, but he was performing at a level that seemed to transcend normal human capability. Was this the result of spiritual preparation? Was this what happened when someone chose faith over convenience and then had to prove the decision was justified? The second inning brought more of the same. Dominant pitching that made the Twins look like they were facing a machine designed specifically to throw unhittable baseballs. By the fourth inning, Koufax had struck out 8 batters and allowed only 1 hit, and the crowd was beginning to understand they might be witnessing something approaching perfection. "This is impossible," David said to Roberto, as Koufax completed another dominant inning. "Yesterday, he was fasting and praying. Today he's pitching like he's not even human." "Maybe that's the point," Roberto replied. "Maybe the spiritual preparation made him better, not worse." David thought about Roberto's observation as the game continued to unfold. Was it possible that Koufax's decision to observe Yom Kippur had actually enhanced his performance rather than compromising it? Had the day of reflection and spiritual preparation somehow elevated his focus and determination to levels that pure physical preparation couldn't achieve? By the 6th inning, with the Dodgers leading 7-0 and Koufax continuing to dominate, David realized he was witnessing something that transcended normal categories of athletic performance. This wasn't just a great pitching performance. This was a demonstration of what was possible when someone chose principle over convenience and then had to prove that choice was justified. The crowd around him seemed to understand the same thing. The nervous energy that had characterized the early innings had been replaced by something approaching awe, as 55,000 people gradually realized they were watching one of the greatest pitching performances in World Series history. "He's going to complete this," Roberto said during the 7th inning stretch. "He's going to throw a complete game shutout after spending yesterday fasting." David nodded, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the specific details of the game had been forgotten. This was about more than baseball. This was about faith, tradition, and the price of excellence. As the 8th inning began, David found himself thinking about his father's words from that morning, about the idea that witnessing extraordinary people could be a form of spiritual experience. Watching Sandy Koufax pitch Game 2 of the 1965 World Series was beginning to feel exactly like that. A reminder that greatness could emerge from the intersection of talent, preparation, and unwavering commitment to principle. The 9th inning was still to come, but David already knew he'd made the right decision about being there. The 8th inning began with Sandy Koufax having thrown 8 innings of nearly perfect baseball, allowing only 2 hits while striking out 12 Minnesota Twins batters. As David Goldstein sat in the left field bleachers, watching the greatest Jewish athlete of his generation dominate the World Series after choosing faith over professional convenience, he realized he was witnessing something that transcended sports entirely. 12 strikeouts, Roberto Sanchez said, checking the scorecard he'd been keeping throughout the game. In 8 innings, after spending yesterday fasting and praying instead of preparing for this game. Around them, the crowd had taken on the reverent quality that marked truly historic sporting events. These weren't just baseball fans anymore. They were witnesses to something approaching the miraculous. 55,000 people united in appreciation of a performance that seemed to defy normal physical limitations. David found himself studying the faces of the Jewish fans scattered throughout the bleacher sections. These were people who'd made the same choice he had, prioritizing community pride over conventional obligations, choosing to be present when their greatest representative faced his biggest test. and they were being rewarded with something that would validate their decision for the rest of their lives. Koufax's eighth inning was a masterpiece of precision and power. His fastball was still explosive, his curveball was still devastating, and the Twins' hitters looked like they were facing a pitcher who was operating on a completely different level from normal human capability. "Look at his face," David said to Roberto as Koufax walked off the mound after striking out the side in the eighth. "He looks like he could pitch 9 more innings." "Maybe fasting and praying was better preparation than anyone realized," Roberto replied. David thought about Roberto's observation as the teams changed sides for the bottom of the eighth. Was it possible that Koufax's spiritual preparation had actually enhanced his physical performance? Had the day of reflection and religious observance somehow elevated his focus and determination to levels that pure athletic training couldn't achieve? The crowd's energy was building toward something approaching frenzy as the 9th inning approached. Everyone in Dodger Stadium understood they were potentially witnessing history, not just a great pitching performance, but vindication of a decision that had been questioned and debated across the country. 3 more outs, David said, more to himself than to Roberto. 3 more outs for Koufax to prove that choosing faith over baseball was the right decision, Roberto added. The bottom of the 8th inning passed quickly, with the Dodgers failing to add to their 7-0 lead, but clearly understanding that their pitcher needed no additional run support. Koufax had transformed what should have been a crucial World Series game into a showcase of individual dominance, carrying his team and his community on his shoulders. As the 9th inning began, David felt his heart pounding with anticipation. Throughout the bleacher sections, Jewish fans were on their feet, understanding that they were about to witness the completion of something that would be talked about for generations. The night Sandy Koufax proved that observing Yom Kippur had made him stronger, not weaker. The first batter of the 9th inning was Tony Oliva, one of the Twins' best hitters and someone who represented Minnesota's last hope for avoiding a complete shutout. Koufax's first pitch was a fastball that seemed to explode past Oliva before the hitter could react. Strike 1. The second pitch was another fastball, this one on the outside corner with such precision that Oliva could only watch it pass. Strike 2. The crowd was on its feet now, 55,000 people screaming encouragement to a pitcher who looked like he was drawing strength from their collective energy. Koufax's third pitch to Oliva was a curveball that started at the letters and dropped below the knees, a breaking ball so perfect that the batter had no choice but to swing and miss. Strikeout number 13. "One down!" Roberto shouted over the crowd noise. The second batter was Harmon Killebrew, a future Hall of Famer who represented the Twins' most dangerous power threat. If anyone could break up Koufax's dominance, it would be Killebrew, whose home run power had carried Minnesota throughout the season. Koufax approached the at-bat with the same methodical precision he'd shown all game. Fastball, strike 1, curveball, strike 2, fastball, strike 3, strikeout number 14. David found himself screaming along with the rest of the crowd, caught up in the collective hysteria of witnessing something that seemed impossible. Sandy Koufax had spent the previous day fasting and praying instead of preparing for the biggest game of his career, and he was now 1 out away from completing one of the greatest pitching performances in World Series history. 2 down, Roberto was shouting. 1 more out. The final batter was Bob Allison, a solid hitter who represented the Twins' last chance to avoid complete humiliation. As Allison stepped into the batter's box, the noise level at Dodger Stadium reached something approaching dangerous levels. 55,000 people screaming for 1 more strikeout, 1 more demonstration that faith and talent could combine to create something approaching perfection. Koufax looked in for the sign, wound up, and delivered a fastball that seemed to carry with it all the hopes and expectations of an entire community. Strike 1. The second pitch was another fastball, this one painted on the outside corner with such precision that Allison could only shake his head in acknowledgement of its perfection. Strike two. David felt tears in his eyes, tears of pride, tears of vindication, tears of understanding that he was witnessing something that would define his relationship with both baseball and faith for the rest of his life. Koufax's final pitch was a curveball that seemed to hang in the air like a prayer before dropping through the strike zone with devastating effectiveness. Allison swung and missed, and 55,000 people exploded in celebration of something that transcended normal categories of athletic achievement. Strikeout number 15, complete game shutout, 7-0 Dodgers. Sandy Koufax had chosen to observe Yom Kippur instead of pitching Game 1 of the World Series, had spent the day fasting and praying instead of preparing physically for the biggest game of his career, and had responded by throwing one of the greatest performances in baseball history. As the crowd celebrated around him, David found himself thinking about the lesson he'd just witnessed. This wasn't just about baseball. This was about the power of choosing principle over convenience, about the possibility that spiritual preparation could enhance rather than compromise physical performance, about the idea that faith and excellence could work together rather than in opposition. Roberto was hugging strangers, caught up in the collective joy of witnessing something impossible. Throughout the bleacher sections, Jewish fans were crying and cheering and embracing each other, understanding that their greatest representative had just validated every choice they'd made about being present for this moment. "Did we just see what I think we saw?" Roberto asked David as the celebration continued around them. "We just saw Sandy Koufax prove that choosing faith over baseball made him better, not worse," David replied. "We just saw someone demonstrate that spiritual preparation can be more valuable than physical preparation." As they began the slow walk down from the bleachers, David realized that his decision to skip religious services and attend the World Series had led him to witness something that was profoundly spiritual, the demonstration that excellence could emerge from the intersection of talent, preparation, and unwavering commitment to principle. The game was over, but the memory would last forever. David Goldstein had chosen to watch Sandy Koufax pitch on the day after Yom Kippur, and he'd witnessed something that would shape his understanding of faith, community, and the price of greatness for the rest of his life. Sometimes the most spiritual experiences happen outside of temple. Sometimes faith reveals itself through fastballs and curveballs. Sometimes choosing to witness greatness is itself a form of worship. The bus ride home from Dodger Stadium felt like traveling in a different universe. David Goldstein sat among hundreds of other fans, all of them processing what they'd just witnessed. Sandy Koufax's complete game shutout in Game 2 of the World Series, thrown the day after he'd chosen to observe Yom Kippur instead of pitching the opener. The conversations around him were filled with words like miraculous, impossible, and historic, and David understood that everyone on that bus was struggling with the same challenge: how to describe an experience that felt larger than normal language could capture. When David arrived home in Fairfax, he found his father waiting in the living room with the evening newspaper, which already featured headlines about Koufax's performance. "Koufax dominates after Yom Kippur," read the Los Angeles Times sports section. 15 strikeouts in World Series shutout, proclaimed the Herald Examiner. "How was the game?" Sewell asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer from David's face. "Pop," David said, sitting down across from his father, "I just watched something that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. Sandy Koufax didn't just pitch well, he pitched perfectly. 15 strikeouts, complete game shutout, after spending yesterday fasting and praying instead of preparing for the game." Sewell studied his son's face and saw something that reminded him of his own youth. when encounters with greatness had shaped his understanding of what was possible in the world. You think his religious observance helped him pitch better? David thought about the question, trying to find words for something that had felt spiritual as much as athletic. I think choosing to do what he believed was right, even when it was difficult, gave him a kind of strength that pure physical preparation couldn't provide. I think faith made him better, not worse. And what did witnessing that teach you? That sometimes the most important spiritual experiences happen outside of temple. That faith isn't just about following rules. It's about making choices that reflect your deepest values, even when those choices seem to conflict with practical considerations. Saul nodded slowly, understanding that his son had learned something important about the relationship between principle and performance, about the possibility that spiritual preparation could enhance rather than compromise excellence. Over the following days, as the Dodgers went on to win the World Series in 7 games, David found himself thinking constantly about what he'd witnessed in Game 2. The performance had become national news, with sports writers across the country debating the significance of Koufax's decision to observe Yom Kippur and its apparent enhancement of his pitching ability. But for David, the lesson went beyond sports. He'd learned something fundamental about the relationship between faith and excellence, about the possibility that choosing principle over convenience could actually improve rather than compromise performance. The experience shaped David's approach to his own life in ways that became clear over the following months and years. When he faced difficult decisions about college, career, and relationships, he found himself thinking about Sandy Koufax's choice to prioritize spiritual obligation over professional convenience and the remarkable performance that had followed. You know what I learned that day? David would tell his children years later when they asked about his most memorable experience at a baseball game. I learned that doing what you believe is right, even when it's difficult, can give you strength you didn't know you had. I learned that faith and excellence aren't opposites. They can work together to create something extraordinary. David did become a sports writer, eventually covering baseball for the Los Angeles Times for 35 years. Throughout his career, he encountered hundreds of athletes who demonstrated various forms of excellence, but none of them ever approached the combination of talent, principle, and spiritual strength that he'd witnessed from Sandy Koufax on October 7, 1965. In 1972, when Koufax was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame, David was among the reporters covering the ceremony. During the press conference that followed Koufax's induction speech, David asked about the decision to observe Yom Kippur instead of pitching Game 1 of the 1965 World Series. Do you think your religious observance affected your performance in Game 2? David asked. Koufax smiled with the expression of someone who'd been asked that question many times over the years. I think doing what you believe is right gives you a kind of peace that can enhance everything else you do. Whether that helped me pitch better, I don't know, but I know it helped me feel right about myself, and maybe that's more important than any individual game. Any regrets about the decision? None whatsoever. Some things are bigger than baseball, and faith is one of them. If observing Yom Kippur had cost us the World Series, I still would have made the same choice. David treasured that conversation, understanding that he'd been able to discuss the most significant sporting event of his youth with the person who'd created it. The exchange reinforced his belief that Koufax's greatness had emerged not just from physical talent, but from unwavering commitment to principle. When David retired from sports writing in 2005, after 4 decades of covering professional athletics, he wrote a final column about the lessons he'd learned from following sports. The centerpiece of the article was his experience watching Sandy Koufax pitch Game 2 of the 1965 World Series. "I've covered Super Bowls and NBA Finals and Stanley Cup championships," he wrote. "I've interviewed Hall of Famers and witnessed remarkable individual performances, but nothing I ever saw compared to Sandy Koufax pitching a shutout the day after choosing faith over professional obligation. That night taught me that the greatest athletic achievements come not just from talent and preparation, but from the strength that emerges when someone refuses to compromise their deepest values." David died in 2018 at age 70 after a long battle with cancer. At his funeral, Rabbi Sarah Goldberg of Temple Beth Am spoke about David's lifelong commitment to documenting the intersection of sports and spirituality. His belief that athletic excellence could provide lessons about faith, character, and the importance of maintaining principle under pressure. "David understood something that many people never learn," Rabbi Goldberg said to the packed sanctuary. "He understood that witnessing greatness, whether in sports, art, or any other field, can be a form of spiritual experience. He understood that being present when someone demonstrates the highest levels of human capability is itself a form of worship." After the service, David's son Michael found among his father's possessions a carefully preserved ticket stub from October 7, 1965, Section 53, Row 12, Seat 8, Dodger Stadium. The ticket was mounted in a frame alongside a photograph of Sandy Koufax in mid-delivery and a typed note that read, "Sometimes $3 buys you 3 hours of entertainment. Sometimes it buys you a lifetime of understanding about faith, excellence, and the power of choosing principle over convenience. Sandy Koufax taught me that doing what you believe is right can make you stronger, not weaker." October 7, 1965, the day I learned that faith and fastballs can work together to create something miraculous. The story of Sandy Koufax's Game 2 performance became part of both baseball folklore and Jewish American cultural history, referenced whenever discussions turned to the intersection of sports and spirituality, the relationship between faith and excellence, the possibility that choosing principle over convenience could enhance rather than compromise performance. But for those who had been there, who had felt the electricity in Dodger Stadium, who had watched a great athlete prove that spiritual preparation could be more valuable than physical preparation, the memory remained something more personal, more immediate, more profound. David Goldstein had spent $3 to watch a baseball game and instead had witnessed a demonstration of what was possible when someone chose faith over convenience and then had to prove that choice was justified. He had learned that the most important spiritual experiences sometimes happen outside of temple, that faith could enhance rather than compromise excellence, and that witnessing greatness was itself a form of worship. The ticket stub remained in its frame in Michael's home office, a reminder of his father's most formative experience and the lesson that had shaped David's approach to both journalism and life, that being present when someone demonstrates the highest levels of human capability, physical, moral, and spiritual, was worth any sacrifice necessary to witness it. Years later, when Michael's own children asked about their grandfather's career as a sports writer, he would tell them about October 7, 1965, when a 17-year-old boy chose to skip religious services to watch Sandy Koufax pitch the day after Yom Kippur. "Your grandfather learned something that day that he never forgot," Michael would explain. "He learned that faith and excellence aren't opposites. They can work together to create something extraordinary. He learned that choosing to do what you believe is right, even when it's difficult, can give you strength you didn't know you had." The lesson passed down through generations of the Goldstein family, along with the understanding that sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences come not from following prescribed rituals, but from witnessing moments when principle meets performance, when someone proves that faith can enhance rather than compromise greatness. Sandy Koufax had chosen to observe Yom Kippur instead of pitching Game 1 of the World Series, had spent the day fasting and praying instead of preparing physically for the biggest game of his career, and had responded by throwing 15 strikeouts in a complete game shutout that helped the Dodgers win their first World Series championship since moving to Los Angeles. David Goldstein had spent $3 he couldn't afford to witness it, and the experience had shaped his understanding of faith, excellence, and the price of greatness for the next 53 years of his life. Sometimes $3 really does buy you everything you need to know about what's possible when someone refuses to choose between faith and excellence. Sometimes the greatest spiritual lessons come from watching someone prove that principle and performance can work together to create something approaching the miraculous. Sometimes being there when history is made is itself a form of prayer.